Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud. So we're here this evening for our weekly monk chat session. So your weekly opportunity to ask any questions related to Buddhism. There's no set topic during monk chat. The topic is whatever you want it to be. So the flow of time is entirely dependent on the flow of questions. So during monk chat, when the questions run out, then we'll end the session. But as long as there continue to be questions being entered into the comments, then we'll continue to respond to replies as best we can and talk about how it relates to Dhamma. So I encourage you to go ahead and start entering questions. And in the meantime, we'll recite the homage to the Buddha, and then we'll take questions as they appear. Namo tassam bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassam bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassam bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So, welcome to the people who are checking in so far. So welcome to R, Margaret, Yankee, Casey, Jason, Louisa, Amy, Wiseman, Linda, and everyone else who's watching. So R says, Venerables, please explain dependent origination in layman's language. I assume you mean dependent origination rather than orientation. Well, actually the Buddha gave a very simple explanation. He said, when this is, that is. When this ceases, that ceases. So it's a very simple summary. The ultimately dependent origination, it's talking about causality, how nothing happens randomly or chaotically or spontaneously, but rather everything happens because of relevant causes and conditions. And this is extremely important because it means then that our dukkha and our delusion are caused by specific conditions, and therefore we can also produce the conditions that lead to being free from dukkha and free from delusion. So as for the specific details of the chain of causality that we find in the suttas, which we call paticca-samuppada, the dependent origination, there's a number of different interpretations, and actually we could talk for hours on the subject. Usually if I'm supposed to give a talk on paticca-samuppada, I'll ask for 3 hours, because I found 3 hours is actually a good amount of time to really go through it properly and give a clear explanation. It's not really possible to give a very brief explanation, but the shortest possible explanation would mean based upon ignorance, so failure to recognize anicca, dukkha, anatta, the 3 characteristics of reality. Based upon that fundamental ignorance, then we generate a sense of self-identity, a sense of self, and self-identity connected to the experience of body and mind. And based upon that, we generate preferences and desires, and based upon that, we experience suffering. And conversely, as we work to eliminate our underlying delusions, so by cultivating the perception of impermanence, the perception of dukkha, and the perception of non-self, then correspondingly that weakens the self-centeredness that's latent in the mind. It weakens the resultant craving, preference, and attachment, and ultimately then weakens and eventually eliminates our suffering, our dukkha and delusion. So that's a very brief explanation of paticca samuppada, but again, not a thorough explanation, because a thorough explanation would take several hours. Anything you want to add on that?
Bhante, I love what you said, because the first thing that came to mind, and I've been thinking about this a lot, is the Four Noble Truths. That's a way of explaining dependent origination, and that's just what Bhante said. And to remove ignorance would be like to apply the Noble Eightfold Path, to get right view, right intentions, which will transform the sankhara element, the tendencies that we have, and which will help us remove suffering. Because in the Four Noble Truths, the cause of our suffering is dukkha. And when we remove that, then it gets rid of like birth, death, old age, sickness, sorrow, lamentation, all that, which is all dukkha. So I've thought a lot about it, like the Four Noble Truths, and the way Bhante explained, like this kind of 4-step or 5-step way of explaining dependent origination is like very simple, and it gets really to the source of it, like the origin, what's causing the other, like second origin, because usually avijja and tanha, right? They talk about like the two origins of our suffering and how to overcome it, and how that gets rid of our dukkha. So I like Bhante's explanation. I haven't heard it like that before, that concise.
Okay. And Casey has a question. Are the hell wardens, as for instance in the Divine Messenger Sutta, are the hell wardens real beings? Seems like a serious and upsetting case of wrong livelihood. Do you want to answer this?
I think they're as real as we are, If we take ourselves to be real, then they're just as real. And we have to understand that, they're also there due to their karma. So, it's not like someone in heaven or us here, like decided, oh, look, there's an opening in the Avicii hell or some other hell. Like, I want to take that job and torture people. No, but they're there as a result of their karma. You can imagine how much longer it must take them for them to get out, because they keep producing more unwholesome karma, unlike the people that they're torturing, which are exhausting their karma. So that's even a worse place, like to have to torture people all the time and see all that pain for so long. I mean, their karma must be real horrible. So I feel actually a lot of almost a sense of hopelessness for them. It's like so sad. Like, how are they going to escape from this? Like, it's horrible. But yes, to the extent that we're real beings, I believe they're also real beings.
Yeah. And we have a question here. Wise Man asks, pain and suffering comes from the attachment we have to things. I am someone who has a lot of love for my family and friends. Is it possible to love without attachment? What might this look like? Yes, absolutely. It is possible to love without attachment. And that's the ideal love. So when we talk about the practice of the Brahma Viharas in Buddhism, this is actually exactly what it's talking about. It's talking about learning how to develop love without attachment. So with metta, we're genuinely wishing for the happiness and happiness and well-being of sentient beings. With compassion, we're wishing for the reduction of suffering of sentient beings. With mudita, we're cultivating a selfless joy and appreciation. And with equanimity, we're training ourselves to not react negatively to anything that happens to any sentient being. So all of this together then results in love without attachment. So we really want others to be happy, but we also recognize that ultimately each person is responsible for their own karma and is generating their own karma, and therefore is generating their own experience of pleasure and pain. And that we cannot control that. As much as we want others to be happy, it is impossible for us to control that. Because they are the owners of their own karma. So we want others to be happy, but we constantly remind ourselves that ultimately they are the ones who are the architects of their own mind. And therefore they are the ones who are the architects of their own suffering or their own joy. So recognizing that we cannot control others and that the only domain where we actually have real control is over our own mind. Learning how to train our own mind for the attainment of awakening. So this means that you would still look after your family and friends, you would still care for them, you would still provide for them, you would still do nice things for them, but all of that with the equanimity of knowing that ultimately their happiness is out of your control. And Margaret asks, would CBD break the fifth precept? What do you think?
I think it depends how we're using it. I know there's like some CBD ointments that you just put on the skin and stuff like that for like pain.
Mm.
So you're not getting intoxicated by those, It's just kind of like, I guess, relieving pain in your body. But, anything that clouds the mind, in any kind of sense, I take it to be breaking the fifth precept, because that's really what it's focusing on, intoxicating the mind, whether it's alcohol or whatever kind of substance we're taking, which is leading us to more confusion and delusion and heedlessness and all this kind of stuff. Should be avoided at all costs. So yeah, so if you're seeing that this clouds your mind, numbs you out, takes you into some other state where you're not really present and aware of what's going on, then it should be avoided.
Yeah, and this issue gets a bit more complicated when dealing with medicines that are necessary, because there are some medicines which have intoxicating effects. And then we have to evaluate, is the medical benefit worth the clouding of the mind? And if we conclude that the answer is no, then we don't take it. But if we conclude the answer is yes, then we want to take the smallest amount possible. So trying to find the dosage that is medically supportive while having the least effect on your mindfulness and self-restraint. And Dharmika says, is it okay to remember the pet cat that passed away? Yes, absolutely. What I actually find useful is when people ask questions about animals, just replace, in this case, replace the word cat with uncle or grandma. So it's like, is it okay to remember the uncle that passed away? Of course it is. Is it okay to remember the grandma that passed away? Of course it is. So, or friend, is it okay to remember my friend that passed away? Of course it is. So it's the same. So cats are sentient beings, and we often form close connections with sentient beings like cats, and we care about them very deeply, and we want them to be happy. And yeah, when they pass away, then we should dedicate merit to them, just as we dedicate merit to deceased relatives, deceased friends. Then we also dedicate merit to deceased pets, because it's not really any different. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. And Hasanta says, I love how other religions might attack the torturers in hell and want to kill them, but the Buddhist monks' approach is to have compassion for their suffering and generation of more suffering. Sadhu. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, this is actually an important point. When you see other people doing bad things, you should have compassion for them, because you recognize that they are generating even more suffering for themselves. By doing those actions, they're just making their life even worse and building up bad karma that will make their future lives even more painful. So yeah, absolutely. You should have compassion for them, because they're hurting themselves as well as others. And Margaret says yes for pain regarding the CBD, I assume. And Obi-Wan says, do you have any advice for dealing with very extreme anger and annoyance? Sometimes with metta meditation, I'm able to cool off, but sometimes they are so overwhelming that I stop meditating. What do you recommend?
Bhante, I was doing this practice, and lo and behold, reading one of the books from Ajahn Chah, that really thick one, the one that has all the stories of his whole life. I saw that, from what I remember, Ajahn Chah used to practice a lot of Chankamana walking meditation when he would get upset, and I was kind of doing that, although I don't get upset that often. But when I would get, I guess, frustrated more than anything, I would do walking, and I would notice within 5 or 10 minutes of walking meditation, and not the slow one, just like regular walking,
Mm.
kind of like it's practice, I think, in your tradition, Bante. Like it would just go away.
Mm.
Like it would just naturally go away. I didn't have to try anything, just walk. And just walk, do walking meditation. Obviously, I'm not like looking around and doing other things, scratching myself. I'm really focusing on the walking, and that's been the best remedy. Like for me, loving kindness is more like a preventative tool that helps me not get angry and have compassion and understanding towards all beings. But if I do feel frustrated or anger, for me, the best thing has always been to do the walking meditation.
Mm. Great. Another thing which can sometimes be really helpful is just to watch your mind. Watch it as though it's somebody else's story about somebody else's annoyance, and then sometimes we start to see how silly it all is. Because usually these stories that we tell ourselves, they only seem important because they're stories about me. If you heard the same person telling their story, then you would just be like, why are you so upset about this? Why are you so angry? It's kind of silly. But it's because it's our own story about ourselves, then that's why we take it so seriously. But actually, if we told our stories to other people, they're usually, well, one, pretty boring, two, pretty shallow, and three, insignificant. So try to see your own story from that third person perspective, and it will tend to lose its power. So Prainaz says, why does our abdomen make sounds only during practice and in the monastery? I would like to suggest that maybe your abdomen makes sounds all the time. It's just that during practice and in the monastery, you're developing stronger awareness. So you're more aware of what your abdomen has been doing all along. So it's just the nature of bodies. The nature of bodies is that they have various fluids and gases rolling around inside, and sometimes that makes noises. And when we pay attention, then we notice those noises. And when we don't pay attention, we don't notice those noises. So when we're actively paying attention to our experience, then one element of that is becoming more aware of our own body noises. And the truth is, everybody else is having the same experience of being aware of their body noises. It's totally normal. It's nothing to worry about. And Lee Kaplan has a number of comments. Lee Kaplan says, I'm thinking a lot about the intersections between Marxism and Buddhism. There's a ton in common. For instance, the use of dialectical materialism. I have no idea what that means. To understand reality and our place within it. I really don't know what dialectical materialism means, and I'm not going to learn, to be just perfectly honest. Let's see. Liberating the self and others. The elimination of self is where a total of historical ideological phenomena. Usually I find that when people say, oh, such and such philosophy or such and such religion or such and such spirituality is basically the same as Buddhism, usually when people say that, they're wrong. It's just because they don't understand Buddhism very well. And in my case, I don't understand Marxism well enough to really talk about it because I haven't studied it in any depth. Anyway, Lee Kaplan says, I'm curious about revolutionary violence. How would the Buddha consider revolutionary violence is my question, given that it solves suffering but can cause it as well. Yeah, so the Buddha is very clear on this. Don't hurt people. Don't be cruel. Don't cause harm. Don't steal things. Also, don't break other people's possessions. So the Buddha was actually very clear that we should avoid violence as much as possible. We should avoid causing violence as much as possible. So in terms of changing existing systems of unfairness and oppression, that's a very good and noble goal, to try to change conditions in society so that things are better for everyone. That's a very noble goal, and it's definitely worth trying to do in a non-violent way. Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, people do better when they have their basic material supports in place. They do better when they have enough food, enough clothing, enough medicine, a decent place to live. That's true. But that's the absolute bare minimum. And it's not really, in the sense that it's not going to bring about the end of suffering. So this actually is, as far as I can tell, it's the tremendous short-sightedness of any kind of materialism-based approach to dealing with social problems. Just because people have more stuff, and just because people have more money, and doesn't necessarily mean they're more happy. It just means they have more stuff and more money. So the Marxist idea of trying to redistribute wealth so that everybody can have more money individually, it's like, well, that's a very lovely idea, and I'm not necessarily either against it or for it. I just don't see it as being remotely relevant to Buddhism. So Buddhism is not about helping balance out the wealth distribution in society. That's not its point. And we do see a few places in the suttas where the Buddha does seem to be actively encouraging things that these days we would call socialist. We see a few places in the suttas where he encourages things like giving money to the poor, like for the government to give money to the poor, for the government to support small businesses through grants and programs that help merchants run small businesses, and so on. Like there's material like that in the suttas, material which does sound a bit like aspects of modern socialism. But that's not ultimately what Buddhism is about. Buddhism is about training our own mind in order to eliminate the causes of suffering, in order to recognize why we're experiencing dukkha and how to eliminate that dukkha from our mind. And it has nothing whatsoever to do with the amount of material wealth that we have. So again, normally when people say like, oh, this other random thing is basically the same as Buddhism, normally they're wrong. Normally it's not the same as Buddhism. Normally it's something different. So maybe Lee, if you could explain in a bit more detail why you think Marxism is similar to Buddhism, and then we can address that more specifically.
Bhante, I do know of someone that this person might be interested into looking up, named he goes by the handle Anarcho Spirituality, and he was on a podcast a couple months ago, and although he's not necessarily like talking about how similar Marxism and Buddhism is, he does talk about a lot of these kind of like socialist ideas and how you can, like, they're found in the suttas, and he points these things out, and he really focuses on like on the Sangha, how like we don't really have any private property and how we kind of live in a commune and these kind of things. So I think if you're more interested in seeing like where there's places where things kind of like match up, like if you're interested in those kind of things, like if you look him up, he's actually working on his thesis right now on like, that's his thing for his master's degree. So his name is Anarcho Spirituality. If you put it on Google, you'll find them and you can learn more about these points. But I think Bhante's right. Like I haven't come across anything that is like Buddhism. Buddhism is very different. The Dhamma is very different. But obviously, I think in many things, there's always things where different ideas meet or they overlap, but they might be similar in some ways, but they're not the same.
Yeah, and another resource you might look up is Ajahn Buddhadasa's theory of Dhammic socialism. So Ajahn Buddhadasa actually was a big proponent of making societies have stronger socialist elements, because again, he saw this as being connected to Dhamma principles of compassion and kindness and fairness and so on. So that'd be another resource you might look into. So Alex says, I notice in one of the suttas that one of the formulations for mind states was contracted versus distracted, exalted versus unexalted, surpassed versus unsurpassed, concentrated versus unconcentrated, and liberated versus unliberated. Can you define some of these states? Well, I mean, without the Pali, it's actually a bit challenging. So because often the translations are a bit awkward. So contracted and distracted are actually not very good translations. Sankitta and Vikitta are the Pali words. The other translations are relatively okay. But in the briefest possible, do you want to answer this?
No, Bhante, you
Okay.
go ahead.
In the briefest terms, it's talking basically about knowing whether the mind is in samadhi or not in samadhi. And it's about knowing whether the mind is in a defiled state or in a non-defiled state. So, for example, an exalted state would be in one of the Brahma Viharas. So unexalted would be not in one of the Brahma Viharas. Again, exalted and unexalted isn't actually the best translation. If I recall correctly, the Pali is mahagata, which means expanded. It doesn't mean exalted. Surpassed versus unsurpassed. Well, the only unsurpassed mind state is that of a fully awakened arhat. So surpassed would mean everything other than the mind of an arhat. Concentrated versus unconcentrated is pretty clear. Liberated versus unliberated. There's two interpretations. One is that liberated means full liberation in the sense of full awakening, full enlightenment. Another one is the idea of temporary liberation, where the mind is temporarily free of the coarse defilements and hindrances. Yeah, there's a little bit on that. Yeah. And Emil says, can studying Pali help me to find a place at a monastery? I don't know of any monastery where they expect you to learn Pali before becoming a monk. And actually, most monasteries, learning Pali isn't even a requirement once you are a monk. There's some exceptions, like there's some monasteries in Sri Lanka where it is basically required to learn Pali. And lots of monks, again, especially in Sri Lanka, lots of monks do learn Pali. I've learned Pali. I find it really useful. But it's not a requirement for ordination, nor necessarily even after ordination. And it is helpful, but it's not strictly required. And can you describe how you practice Anapana? Would you like to talk about that?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I'd like to focus just on the first part. The first part really, I think it's very important just to kind of know what we're doing, because I find a lot of people, they have a lot of misunderstandings about it. Like people are like, mostly in the West, there's so much force, and we do have some effort there, but I find that for Westerners, there's too much force, too much effort, and they kind of bear down on either the nose or the abdomen very hard. And another thing is that people get very intellectual about it, like, oh, I'm breathing in, oh, I'm breathing out. Is it short breath? Is it a long breath? And for me, it's the practice is really that we have to remember that it's within the Kaya Nupassana, so like observing the body. So really, the steps are pretty self-explanatory, right? Like aware one breathes in, one breathes out, long or short, right? And then observe. It says like tranquilizing the bodily formations, which I don't know how to translate that in a nice way. I'm not happy with that way that it usually comes out or whatever it says. But the way I take that is just to be really aware of the entire body, because it's within the Kaya Nupassana. So the way I practice the breath is, yes, maybe in the beginning there's some places where the breath is more highlighted. It's easier for you to find a focus point for the mind to rest, and you'll notice very quickly that the mind gets distracted and like going into the past, going into the future, or your butt hurts, or you want to scratch your face, or there's a sound, and your mind wants to do everything but focus on what's happening right now. And we're kind of using the body, the breath is part of the body as an anchor to the present moment, to be aware of what's happening right now, to be able to see this process that's happening all the time. So the way I practice it is just really first maybe starting with the nose or abdomen, or just the breath in general if you can, and just watching the whole body and really focusing on the Kaya Nupassana aspect of it, the tactile sensations, the somatic experience of all these things that are going on in the body, and practicing a lot of stillness, a lot of stillness, not only in body but and also in mind. You'll find something very interesting that the more you practice like stilling the body, I think that's another way also to translate the tranquilizing bodily formations. The mind also becomes calm, like they kind of get in tune with each other, so the more you still your body, the more the mind becomes also calm. So we really don't try to control the breath or do anything fancy like that. It's just really a practice on trying to see clearly and becoming familiar with the body, and noticing how you're always wanting to be everywhere but here, giving into aversion. Oh, I don't like the pain. My mind's going somewhere else. Oh, wouldn't it be nice to have some chocolate cake? Your mind's going to somewhere else, right? And seeing how aversion and and greed and lust and sadness and resentment and all these other things are always pulling you. You know, you're like these the five animals that the Buddha talks about in the post, right? And that simile of the animals getting pulled in all directions by your senses and by all these other things. And really, we're using the body as an anchor, as a tool to bring us to the present moment, awareness to see what's going on right now. And then, you know, we'll go through all the other satipathanas and see the impermanence of all these things, that they're unsatisfactory, that they're not under our control. And we get some sort of like disenchanted by them. We get dispassionate, and we kind of let them go, right? And then we're free from them. So that's like the ultimate level where you want to get. But in the beginning, I think it's what I like to emphasize about the anapanasati is it's a whole body kind of practice, about awareness of the entire body, and it's very visceral, very somatic, very tactile. And you know, it's not so much about like telling yourself, well, I'm breathing now, I'm not breathing, well, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. Like, you know, you don't have to do a play by play, which I find unfortunately, a lot of meditators doing like play by play of every single thing that's going on, when the Buddha is just telling you, like, no, observe the body, kaya nupassana, watch the body. So that would be my advice, you know, to start off with.
Yeah, good. And Wise Man asks, I notice when I meditate, I experience a lot of the judging mind towards myself and others. Would loving kindness be a good way to counteract these thoughts of judging mind? Well, it depends on what you mean by judging mind. In terms of evaluating our experience, actually recognizing what's wholesome and what's unwholesome is a very important part of Buddhist practice. So one might call that judgment, but actually it's useful, a form of judgment that's useful. It's arising from our capacity to recognize right and wrong. So it's important, though, to temper that with the perception of non-self. So, for example, if you notice that there's a stain on your clothing, does that then mean that you throw out the whole shirt, or does it just mean that you wash out the stain? So similarly, if you notice that there's a stain in your mind, does that mean that your entire mind is absolutely hopelessly tainted forever and all eternity? Does it mean that you are an inherently awful person? No, it just means there's a little bit of dirt in your mind that needs to be washed out. So it's important to distinguish then, recognizing that the characteristics and objects of mind that we see, these characteristics of mind are not who we really are. They're just temporary experiences. And so when we recognize that there's something there which is harmful, then we remove it. And we do so joyfully, knowing that in recognizing harmful mind states, that's proof that our wisdom is operating. In making an effort to remove those harmful mind states, then we make progress towards awakening. So this is actually really good stuff. This is how the judging mind can actually be a useful thing, a good thing. Where it's not so useful is when it's just hatred or this like aversive hostility. Then that's where it's not actually useful at all. And yeah, in that case, then practicing loving kindness and compassion might be useful. And in particular, compassion towards yourself, recognizing the pain that you're causing yourself with these ways of thinking, and wishing for yourself to be free of that pain, free of that discomfort. Do you have anything else on that?
Just Bhante, that a lot of the times, a lot of things that we do is because of discomfort. You know, like we try to avoid being uncomfortable at anything and anything that disturbs us being comfortable. We push it away and we hate it. So a lot of this criticism towards others and towards ourselves is like us experiencing something, being uncomfortable with it, and then reacting in our usual patterns of pushing and throwing it away. I don't want it. I hate this. So, just kind of try to focus on understanding and being okay with being uncomfortable, you know? And I think that it really helped me with my practice, just learning that it's okay to be uncomfortable. It doesn't mean that I have to do something right away, even if it's just thinking in a very critical, judgmental way about others. I don't have to do that. I can learn to be uncomfortable.
Yeah. And Jerry's asking, please speak a little on the generating as yet unarisen wholesome states aspect of right effort, specifically any how-tos. Yeah, actually, loving kindness meditation is a great example. That's deliberately producing a wholesome mind state. So you look at your mind and you're like, oh, there's not much metta here. I'm going to make an effort to produce metta. And then you practice metta meditation and metta arises. And so then you work on strengthening it and magnifying it and maintaining it. So that's a very clear example. The Brahma Viharas are kind of a classic example of that aspect of right effort. And Lee asks, what are some of your favorite ways to practice walking meditation?
Oh, that's is that a follow-up to the other one? Probably, huh?
Well, this was the one who asked about Marxism, so I think it's unrelated.
Okay. So there's two ways that I do it. One is very kind of like the one I described earlier, and I usually use that one more when I guess agitation is a better word for what I was trying to talk about earlier. When I feel a little agitation, I'll just pick maybe, I don't know, 5-6 yards max, and just kind of walk back and forth, find somewhere around where I can walk back and forth. Usually outside works better for me. And then if I'm indoors and I'm just doing kind of walking meditation more for the general purpose of just cultivating awareness and not so much trying to overcome like agitation, I do more kind of like a slower one, but it's not robotic, it's not like lifting, moving places. It's just like calm, smooth, natural, and it's fluid. I'm just kind of walking very calmly and paying attention to my whole body, like moving in space. Yeah, it's like a very body awareness practice, and my whole body moving through space, and also, not letting my mind get pulled away by thoughts and other distractions that are going on. And then usually for those, I pick like a shorter, maybe like 8 to 10 steps, and then I turn around, or if there's enough space, I'll do a circle, a square, wherever. And that's like my slower one that one I do a lot more often. Yeah, so those are usually the two ways that I practice walking meditation, either kind of like outside a little bit quicker with more space, or inside shorter and a little bit more calm and slow for just general sati practice.
Yeah, for me, the kind of walking meditation I usually like to do is walking back and forth in a straight line that's about roughly 20 paces long, and walking about 3/4 of normal speed, so a little bit slower than a normal walking speed, and mostly focusing on the sensation of the feet against the ground. And actually, my favorite method lately has been to use the word metta. And so with the right foot, I think met, and the left foot ta. So as I'm walking, it's metta, metta, metta. And this helps to promote both mindfulness of the body and also metta, loving kindness.
But that's how my teacher would teach walking meditation first, like metta walking meditation.
Yeah, I find it really useful. Yeah. And Hasanta says, when you have a good understanding of Pali, can you see what is original text and what has been added later? Often, yes. So in it should say, by the way, that in the suttas, about 99% of the material seems to be authentic. So there is a tiny fraction of material which seems to have been added later or altered later. And yeah, you can tell. So knowing Pali is one way of telling, but also sometimes it's just a matter of the content. So there's a distinct flavor to the Dhamma. As the Buddha himself said, the Buddha said that all the Dhamma has one distinct flavor. So every once in a rare while, you'll come across something which has a different flavor. And if you've studied the suttas well, if you studied the Dhamma well, then you can identify that. You can identify when something doesn't quite taste like Dhamma. But yeah, I mean, knowing Pali also helps because the style of Pali that's used in the later writings is distinctly different from the older form of Pali. And Misty Moon says, can you tell us what fetters are let go in the third jhana?
Usually when I think about the jhanas, I think about the hindrances, or like the overcoming the hindrances going into the first jhana, and then the development of the factors of the four jhanas. I'm not really familiar with like talking about fetters in reference to jhana.
Yeah, fetters is usually a translation of Sangyojana, which is about stages of awakening. So I agree with Bhante Sanatavihari. It's more talking about hindrances is usually more relevant to jhana. I'm also a bit curious why you're specifically asking about third jhana. Realistically, most people are still trying to figure out how to get first jhana. So it's asking about third jhana is usually getting a little bit ahead of oneself. Yeah, just something to think about. Yeah, in third jhana, again, why are you asking about third jhana? Unless you're getting first and second jhana and you don't know what to do next, why are you asking about third jhana? Yeah, I mean, basically just put your mind on your meditation object and hold it there, and you'll naturally go into jhana. Jhana is really not complicated. It's just difficult, but it's not complicated. Just hold your mind still, keep it alert, and naturally everything else will start falling away, and the mind will become very, very focused. And Mary, it's very kind of you to offer to take us to the art exhibit. If you could send us a text message or an email, and we can see if that's going to be possible. That's very kind of you to offer. And that's the last question here. So I don't see any other questions. So Edward says, I'm grateful for the Buddhist teachings on family. It has taken me a long time of practice to soften my heart towards my only living parent. Now that she is elderly, I've let go of the past and used Dhamma. Good. Yeah. Very good. And Misty says, yeah, clarifying they were talking about the hindrances. Yeah, I mean, actually, all 5 hindrances are gone by the time you enter first jhana. And it's just after that, the mind is becoming increasingly silent and still. So in first jhana, the mind is extremely unified and focused, but there's still a little bit of noisiness and wobbling in the back of the mind. And as that fades away, then the mind moves into second jhana. Then as one's mind becomes even more peaceful and it settles into a deeper state of serene joy, then also the more agitating factor of euphoria starts to fade. So it's, yeah, the hindrances are already gone by the time you enter first jhana. And after that, it's just a matter of the mind becoming increasingly peaceful and steady. So that's the last question. So I think we can go ahead and conclude at this time. So we'll go ahead and end the session with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.